an American president gets frustrated with an Israeli prime minister because they realize they've led them down a merry path. And then they leak to the press the contents of that conversation and the frustration and the salty language and the expletives. And like, spare me? Like, really? I mean, who cares whether you swore at the Israeli prime minister? Are you going to follow it through and use your leverage? Are you going to actually threaten things? Are you going to challenge the power structures within your own politics, to put it accurately? And if the answer to that is no, then I really don't care if you escalate up the F word ladder.
The last time I interviewed Daniel Levy, former Israeli peace negotiator and expert commentator on the Middle East, I've got to confess, I had certain expectations. I'd thought that I would encounter someone who still was an ardent two-state believer. Instead, I found someone who not only was speaking in terms that were a complete challenge to the framework of the Oslo Accords, was talking scathingly about Oslo as a vehicle designed to frustrate the ambitions of Palestinian statehood. And I thought, there's a story here. How does a man go from being one of Israel's foremost negotiators to becoming one of its foremost critics? We met on Wednesday, which is 2 days before the agreement was supposed to be signed between Iran and the United States. And we talk about how the joint Israeli-American war on Iran has impacted the Middle East more widely. We discuss whether Israel will ever fess up to having nuclear weapons. And we talk about the future of forging a Jewish identity outside of the parameters of Zionism. And I have to apologise for the football haters out there. We do discuss the beautiful game just a little bit, but I promise it's political. I hope you enjoy the interview. Daniel Levy, I was very reluctant to invite you back, and you know why.
I do know why, but I'm not allowed to mention it, apparently, because it will be lost in the edit.
It will be lost in the edit. It's nothing political, just to reassure our viewers, it's everything to do with football.
And North London.
And North London.
Forever.
That's the real peace process that needs to happen.
Well, okay, so actually that for me is where I want to live out my tribalism. For 90 minutes on the weekend and then with some banter between games. But that's where we should live out our tribalism as far as I'm concerned.
All right, before we get into it,
Yes.
I wonder what you make of this. Is one of the things I've been thinking about football and football culture is that in many ways, the UK has been a success story of taking on hooliganism, et cetera, but we've ended up with a more commercialised product.
Yeah.
Is there a bit of a trade-off here, which is a little bit of violence on the away days and you get an exciting, authentic grassroots football culture, but you can't have sort of safety and authenticity at the same time?
Okay, I'm not at all sure that that's the case. Mm-hmm. I think you could have, well, maybe here I am in some way agreeing, enough of the safety element without that. So, I mean, being honest, yeah, my moments of, oh, this is all too commercial, I'm going to stop supporting this team, especially when they get a dodgy shirt sponsorship as if my team have just done, do coincide with the moments where we're playing really badly. So, I mean, it's harder to sustain that, which is also, by the way, we'll get onto matters Middle East and Israel related. But it's also why I think some campaigns which say, oh, boycott your team is not going to work. You need to meet the football audience where they are and say, now thinking about Ireland's upcoming match with Israel, Ireland should never have been put in that position because Israel should not be playing in international football at the moment in UEFA, etc. But that's where you have to. So I think sometimes the strategy of what you try and sanction, what you try and boycott has to take that into account. I've kind of gone beyond authenticity.
I mean, I suppose, this is our transition from football into politics, is that during the anti-apartheid movement, sporting and cultural boycotts were really powerful. And I suppose just from a tactical perspective, when do you judge that you can ask people to turn away from something that they really, really love, be it football, rugby, cricket, music, performing arts of any kind? Because I think with football, I judge that as a really hard ask, but maybe that's just because that's the thing that I love. You go back and you look at movements of the past and you go, well, this is quite a meaningful way of applying pressure.
Yeah, and I just want to express respect for how deep that love must go after a season like this for you to still love it.
It's called masochism. It's a great English
we've
tradition.
All been there. So I don't think that is the ask, and it wasn't the ask in the anti-apartheid movement. And that's what I think people have to go back, look at what happened and wrap their heads around. Because what this was about was sending a signal to, it was meeting the kind of Afrikaner apartheid world where it was and sending the signal that, no, it's not normal. And so you can't go on normal rugby tours and play in that international sport in the way you do, because if you did, your assumption would be the rest of the world treats this as normal, and you meet that in a place that matters to them, in a place which is part of the national pride. So, and this is what I'm saying, so no one should be saying, stop supporting Liverpool because Standard Chartered is invested in this, stop supporting Arsenal because they've got deal on their shirts, stop buying the shirts, whatever. What this should be saying is that Israel should not be playing in international football, but this isn't going to come from Gianni Infantino, is it? Or from UEFA. So this has to be fans making it impossible for there to be normal sporting tournaments with Israel in it. Eurovision is probably even more significant because they do quite well in that. I mean, it's only once a year, but it's a touchstone. Basketball would be even more credible as well. And so, it's not about punishment for the sake of punishment. I don't believe a country can be sanctioned into giving stuff up. It can be sanctioned into people having a different conversation about the cost-benefit calculation, about, well, if everyone is beginning to treat this as not normal, I'm sure they're wrong, but maybe we just need to question that. And more people in that country will say, yes, of course, they shouldn't be doing this. But now let's look at the reality of the problem we have.
I mean, there's another side of it, which is, I was thinking about Maccabi Tel Aviv. So earlier this year, obviously, Maccabi Tel Aviv were to play Aston Villa. The game would have been
you can only dream of being in.
In a tournament you could only dream of winning. But they were supposed to be playing in Birmingham, which has obviously got a big British Muslim population. Maccabi Tel Aviv has a long and storied history of racist hooliganism. Now, as a team, they are not alone in that. Some of our own homegrown teams have a fine tradition of racist hooliganism as well. But it seemed to me that we were in this upside down world where the kinds of punishment that you would see being meted out to, whether it was like Red Star Belgrade or anybody else, that there was a sort of special pleading going on by British politicians and also by the Israeli government as well for Maccabi Tel Aviv. And I ended up in a place where I was like, if you guys want it that badly, have it. Right? Let the Maccabi fans come here. And that's actually a point at which people see what kind of political culture Israel has produced. Like, is there an argument there, which is actually Israel's reputation abroad is protected by the lack of meaningful contact people have with it?
Okay, so I would argue this should never have been about hooliganism or racist chants. If that happens, there is a procedure. I'm not that familiar with it, but you occasionally see games behind closed doors or away fans banned for a match, for 2 matches, whatever. The point here is something else. The point here is, I would say, threefold. Number one, when a country is in illegal occupation of another country, especially when that country is also a member of FIFA. The Palestine Football Association is recognized, it has membership, Palestine plays in the World Cup, etc. But they are in permanent illegal occupation. So that should have, and we know Russia isn't playing in international football. Secondly, Israel actually maintains clubs in the settlements. So if you recognize the 1967 border of Israel, but you take international law seriously, settlements are illegal under international law inside the Israeli league, not in their Premier Division, but it doesn't matter. It's in the equivalent of the Championship or League One. There are teams that play in the settlements. There are stadia. So the Israeli Football Authority has responsibility over teams in that illegal. And there was a whole case in UEFA, like we've been saying, hard to win in a UEFA setting, hard to win when the Palestine Football Association is an outpost of the PLO and PA, so they're not very strategic. So, but that would be grounds for Israel not to participate. By the way, Russia did something similar in Crimea after 2014, but Russia accepted that those Crimean teams couldn't be in the league, so they stayed in good standing for a period of time. I mean, thirdly, and this probably isn't the measure, but let's also just pause for a moment and look at the destruction to Palestinian sporting facilities and capacities, the killing of Palestinian sports people, the killing of Palestinian footballers, members of the Palestinian national football team. Many of them are in the Palestinian diaspora, but those who are locally based in the Palestinian territories, especially that's taken place in the destruction of the last 2.5 years. Those are the grounds, not hooliganism, not racist chants. Those things are unpleasant. Those things, why not expose people to? But it's also, it's that signal that you send, whether it was to apartheid South Africa or to Israel under actually existing Zionism. It's, can Israelis at the end of the day turn around and say, actually, it's okay, we've got this, the world isn't going to do anything to us. And they normalize us. And then you stifle the very debate, the very incentive structure that should be playing out inside a place that's doing what it's doing.
It's a miracle we've found something football related that we can agree on, other than you'll never sing that. I want to move on to think about the Iran Memorandum of Understanding. So we're speaking on Wednesday. Earlier this week, the Trump administration, followed by the Iranian government, announced that there had been a sort of framework for a ceasefire agreement. Obviously, people don't know what the text is of the Memorandum of Understanding. There are some indications that the free flow of goods can go through the Strait of Hormuz, but that also Iran can sell fossil fuel products again on the global market. To what extent is it likely that Trump will be able to achieve anything that is significantly different than the deal that was ratified by the Obama administration?
Right. So 2015, Obama administration, what's called the JCPOA deal with Iran, primarily addresses the nuclear program. 2018, in his first term, Trump withdraws from that agreement. And I don't think inexorably, but we have been on a path to where we've landed in the last year with the strikes in June 2025, led by Israel, where America joins for one day. And then late February, they launch a joint war against Iran. Let's pause for a minute. The most bizarre thing is that in the initial implementation of this deal, we're talking, as you say, before Friday signing, 48 hours is still a long time to try and upend things, but let's assume that's been signed. What is going to be implemented there is essentially 2+ components. One, a cessation of hostilities, and 2, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to all kinds of shipping traffic, including fossil fuels and many other things that have been stuck as a consequence, which have had a massive knock-on effect, inflation, food prices, food security in many parts of the world. Why do I say pause at that? Neither the hostilities nor the closure of the Hormuz existed before they launched this unnecessary illegal war of aggression. So the only 2 things that have been agreed are to reverse the situation to what it was previously. And then there's an understanding as to what will be negotiated in the subsequent 60 days, including, as you said, some things which may kick in immediately, primarily in terms of perhaps some unfreezing of Iranian assets that have been held for an awfully long time by the US, and Iranian oil being able to go to market in ways that were occasionally allowed, but were also challenged in the past. And so where Trump has landed is in a place where your starting point is Iran has more leverage than it did previously. And look, as far as I'm concerned, it can be true at one and the same time that it's good if they do the deal. It's good if this gets seen through. And it was also, of course, a totally unnecessary war that has strengthened Iran, weakened the US, weakened Israel, I would say, as well, without ignoring the hits that Iran has taken. Also, not only the assassination of much of its leadership, the destruction of significant parts of its infrastructure, the killing of many civilians, and a further devastating effect on its economy. It's hard to imagine that there will be a deal that is tighter, stronger than there was previously. If there is one that is a slight upgrade in that respect, it still wasn't worth this war. That doesn't mean that Trump won't spin it that way. So that's the other thing, which again, it has its advantages. It has its advantages that anyone who's a sentient being can look at this and say, that's absolute nonsense. But he will, browbeat any media that challenges him. He, in his own little information bubble and echo chamber, will claim this is the greatest deal ever. If that's what you need in order to not continue with your war, I'm fine with that.
I mean, you've already answered this question a bit, but I would love to hear more about it. A little while ago, you told Democracy Now! That this war is about how far Israel can extend its dominion, how much of a hard power, dominant hegemon it can be in the region. 2 days is a long time in negotiations, but assuming that some kind of ceasefire agreement is signed and we can reflect on this period of time, to what extent did Israel realize its objectives?
Well, look, this is something that's playing out right now in Israel. I mean, it is poisonous, the atmosphere around this. And for the prime minister himself, Benjamin Netanyahu faces re-election the date hasn't been set yet. It will be in September or October of this year. He has consistently been doing badly in the polls. There's been a kind of strange consistency to that since he was elected, even through everything in Gaza and through this war now. And that the headlines are kind of fiasco, non-existent achievements. There's some challenging of that, but it's even in the Netanyahu press, who have turned on Trump. They're now saying, you're Chamberlain, you've sold us out. Quite remarkable stuff. Netanyahu is trying to sell this as, look, we've removed the leadership. Their nuclear program has been further set back. He will, to some extent, be able to swing in behind that Trump narrative. So when Trump gives his victory speech, and we're all like laughing, in Israel, Trump still has more traction. And Netanyahu will be able to kind of jump on the bandwagon of that, but there will be far more skepticism pervasive there. Because let's remember, both what Israel sold to its own public and the general public in terms of what this war was going to be about and going to achieve, and also what he apparently sold to the President of the United States. There's the famous story that Netanyahu went to the White House, was taken down to the Situation Room, got the head of the Mossad on the screen behind him, and this is where they made the pitch. It was a pitch they'd made to numerous previous American presidents who apparently, with their teams around them and with the interagency process in American decision-making, didn't fall for it. But this president
Not
did.
even Hillary Clinton fell for it, and she'd have loved a war with Iran.
Well, but she was never president.
Well, no, but as in what I mean is she gave an interview recently where she said, the Obama administration got pitched this too.
So you've had Hillary make that. You've had Gates, the former Secretary of Defense. You've had John Kerry. They've all now been interviewed. I hadn't seen the Hillary interview, but that you're still able to watch Hillary Clinton interviews is kind of takes us back to other things you're still able to watch. But they have all now, in these interviews, said, yes, we were in the room when more or less the same pitch was made, and no, we didn't buy it. Trump did. What was that pitch? That pitch, because remember, last June 2025, we were being told it was done. This was the greatest obliteration. The nuclear weapons program had been absolutely destroyed. The missile capacity had been destroyed. So what we were being told? Oh, actually, Subsequently, they had managed to regain some of that capacity. We'll destroy that. We'll destroy their any kind of missile capacity. We're going to definitively cut off their proxies, and we'll probably get regime change as well. And that was defined as a goal. And one of the things Netanyahu tried to tell the US administration was you can have Kurdish armed fighters come in and seize a part of Iranian territory, and that would also be the beginnings of the undoing of the central Iranian state, because that could almost become like an, they would call it a liberated zone, I guess, inside Iran. The Iranian system comes out of this, for now, strengthened, having held together. Who would have thunk it that when you're under bombardment, which includes your basic infrastructure, which includes schools, you rally around the flag, right?
Wow,
I could never have guessed it.
Iran has had more than a decade to prepare for this war, really, when you think about it, right?
So, Israel has been conducting, sometimes with the US, a shadow war against Iran. We've seen the assassination of scientists. We've seen special ops, things that have gone on there. We've seen cyber warfare, Stuxnet, if people remember that.
Qasem Soleimani's
We've seen assassination of Soleimani. So, as you say, this is the amazing ability to repeat hubristic nonsense. Netanyahu apparently, and not just him, the Israeli system apparently could not conceive of a reality in which they successfully brought America into a war with Iran, and Iran could outwit them and out-strategize them. And there's obviously deep racism there as well in terms of, these Iranians couldn't do that. We've been there before, Vietnam and elsewhere. And it's also how asymmetric warfare works. You outsmart your enemy in place. You don't go toe-to-toe with them where you know you're going to lose. You suddenly close down the Strait of Hormuz, etc.
Well, so I want to ask this question because obviously there were certain things that wouldn't necessarily be immediately clear to everyone. The success that Iran has had in sort of decentralizing its military being one of them. But closing the Strait of Hormuz, everyone knew that's Iran's trump card, all right? Idiots like us based in southeast London had been saying this for well over, a year and a bit. We'd say, okay, well, obviously you're not going to go for a war with Iran because they've got the Strait of Hormuz. This is a global oil price shock, which even though America is a net energy exporter, will hit the American economy hard. So many of Iran's actions were neither irrational nor unforeseeable. So who fucked up? Who failed to see how powerful the Strait of Hormuz would be? Was that predominantly a miscalculation of Israel? Or was it a miscalculation on the part of the Trump administration?
Yeah, and I spoke to friends, one friend in particular who's the kind of defense correspondent of a very, very major media outlet in the US. And she was saying, you know how many times we've written this story about the Strait of Hormuz? It was totally predictable that Iran would strike American and sometimes other assets in the Gulf was totally predictable. And I think the assessment was that if sufficient American with Israeli firepower were brought to bear, this would be unsustainable from the Iranian side. I assume that was their assessment. Embedded in that was an understanding on the part of the US, Israel and others of how fragile, how brittle the Iranian system was. So you even had stories during this war, relatively early on, I think in the Wall Street Journal, about how the genius Israeli targeting with drones of besieged militia and regime police checkposts. And that was now removing the element of fear from the Iranian public. And there is this phenomenon of getting high on your own supply, of believing your own lies. And look what happened in Iran and the generally repressive nature of the Iranian government system is a reality. But if you really believe the number that you're telling yourself, about 30,000 plus dead, which is a fabrication, even the credible Iranian opposition groups were nowhere near that estimation. If you're telling yourself that, and if you're believing the Pahlavisd propaganda machine, or the MEK propaganda machine, or the Iranian opposition media outlets that you're funding, if you actually start taking your information from that and you believe that, then you're very likely to radically misread the reality inside Iran. And that's what they consistently did. Now, there's an interest in Israel. It's I would also argue it's part of the hollowing out of some of the systems and structures of the Israeli establishment. That you've got ideologues in there. I don't want to suggest that there were pragmatists who were therefore, on a good day, kind of full of humanism and love for international law and acceptance of their neighbors. No, but there was some pragmatism in there. And a lot of that has been hollowed out. You have someone who I recommend people pay attention to, Danny Citrinowicz, who's been an Israeli commentator throughout this, who headed up in military intelligence. He headed up this file for many, many years, has subsequently left. And from the beginning, he was saying, you've got this horribly wrong. And he would go on Israeli TV and then built more of a following, kind of his X account was being followed. But he was being paid no attention to, and actually spoke to him. And he said, oh, no, I'm just considered the IRGC guy now. And he's the one who's kind of told it like it is. So there was an incapacity to believe that in Israel. And in the US, you have the hollowing out of a system because that's how the Trump administration operates. So there's no place for expertise. There's no place. So do they have analysts in their own intel system who are like, hey, actually, were they being paid any attention to? No.
I mean, twice now, Israel and then the US have launched airstrikes when negotiations are still ongoing with Iran, right? So that's, twice now in the past year or so. Realistically, what does that mean for how Iran are going to see talks in the future?
It's great for trust, isn't it?
It's great for trust.
Yes, it's partly a rhetorical question, but that is one of the real challenges now. I don't even think the word trust comes into it because there wasn't trust anyway, but believability. The kind of, okay, we'll go along with this. And this is credit to the mediators that they've even got to the stage that they've managed to get to. Because they are really working against the grain. As you say, June 2025, an additional round of talks with Omani mediation is planned. The Americans are due to show up. Israel bombs the night before those talks. February 2026. The Omani foreign minister is in Washington on on American media, talking about the progress that had been made in the talks. Later that night, the joint bombing campaign begins. But I think what is different, and Iran could overplay its hand. I don't want to rule that out either. But what is different this time around is that Iran now looks at this and says, you've thrown everything at us. You've tried this. We now have demonstrated that we have a response. We've seen your vulnerabilities. So I think they're in a slightly stronger position, or maybe slightly is redundant there. And that then means that so much of what happens next revolves around the ability on the American side to negotiate pragmatically, seriously, and with a win-win outcome in mind.
I mean, you've been involved in negotiations yourself, and I suppose one of the things I'm really interested in is practically, if you're part of a negotiation team, how do you go about trying to build a sense of trust or rapport with your opposite numbers when obviously you've got, sets of politicians on either side playing to domestic audiences in such a way which might not be conducive to finding, a nice landing zone.
So the stuff that is probably obvious and dictates itself is all very relevant there, just in terms of trying to break down the formality. That's why these things are often held in absolute seclusion and in retreat. So the classic kind of, they went for a walk in the woods and saw teddy bears having a picnic. No, and kind of develop this out of the negotiation room rapport, understanding the other side, understanding what makes them tick, doing your homework, knowing what they need. First of all, understanding the concept that the victory speech that you're going to go home and give has to be mirrored by a victory speech that they have to go home and give. There can be contradictions, they can cut a crop, but each side will have to have that. And that doesn't guarantee anything, but those are some of the basics. And going in with a realistic sense of what you can get out of this. So if you've just had a war, for instance, you're not going to achieve things in a negotiating room that are maximalist that you couldn't achieve militarily, okay? Fast forward. What are we seeing in this context? There is a benefit to having lead negotiators who absolutely have the confidence and can speak in the name of the ultimate decision maker, the president. So in that respect, I'm fine with Jared Kushner and Witkoff being in the room. It's actually more useful than a Tony Blinken who the negotiators could say, yeah, whatever, I'll get the president on the phone.
I mean, Trump sort of seemed a bit like, when Logan Roy makes his underlings do bore on the floor? Like, that's how he was treating Tony Blinken, bore on the floor.
Yeah, and anyway, let's not go to Blinken and Sullivan and the people who were, of course, so complicit in everything that happened in Gaza and should never be in office again. But the problem is, if people who don't come from the world of this negotiation, who come from the world of real estate negotiation, haven't internalized...
Which is so zero-sum.
Absolutely. Who see this through the lens of business deals, which adds a potential caveat that I'll come back to. But if they haven't internalized what is the environment they are now working in, what are the rules of this environment, if they see the Iranian side in two-dimensional terms. I mean, there are stories of Witkoff trying to bond with and by the way, I give them credit that they spoke to Hamas. So they spoke to Hamas. And there's a story of Witkoff apparently thinking he would bond with the chief Hamas negotiator, Khalil al-Hayya, because they had both lost sons. Now, I don't want to take away from the tragedy of it, but Witkoff's son died of an overdose. Khalil al-Hayya's son was murdered by the Israelis, probably using American weaponry. These are not comparable things on anything other than the... Okay, so have Witkoff and Jared done their homework? Do they have a team of experts in the room? Okay, so it's now you guys... Maybe they will in the future, but thus far that hasn't been the case, which is why it's needed Qataris sometimes, Pakistani mediators sometimes, Egyptians, Turks, others playing a role. But it's also needed them to try and convince Trump himself. There are reports out of what's happened just in the last few days where they had to constantly be going back and trying to prevent this from escalating and trying to get this deal across the line. Most people, and I would, in this respect, align myself with the majority, which I don't normally find myself doing, have limited expectations in terms of what can be achieved in the next 60 days. And in part, it's because none of those things which gravitate towards the likelihood of a successful negotiated outcome, or most of those things are not in place. One other thing worth mentioning is that a kind of taboo has been broken on direct Iranian-American negotiations. So this Iranian leadership, so it's interesting. They kill the supreme leader, Khamenei, who's been there for an awfully long time. And one of the things that the Iran watchers I most respect have been telling us for years is he was something of a bottleneck. It's not that he was the most extreme guy. It's that he didn't make decisions. And it could be the case that you have a new leadership that is going to stick more to principle, but is also going to be easier when it comes to certain symbolic things. So by the time people listen to this, is there likely to have been something in public where Americans and Iranians are signing in a way that you didn't see in the past? Have we already seen that in some of the negotiations? We have. So that's at least one thing going for it. But many other things aren't, including what will be a relentless Israeli campaign to undermine this.
I mean, you mentioned earlier that from Iran's perspective, they might be thinking, all right, Israel, America, you've thrown everything at us and we understand what your weaknesses are and what our strengths are. There's obviously one way in which that hasn't happened, which is the nuclear taboo is still intact. Are there any circumstances where you can see Israel moving away from its policy of nuclear ambiguity? Shall we say, over the status of whether it has its own nuclear arsenal or not? Because that's one thing where I go, that's something which hasn't been thrown at Iran.
So there are periodic debates inside Israel as to whether it should abandon nuclear ambiguity. I think the fact of an Israeli nuclear weapon is such an established fact that the ambiguity is a moot point. Israel is an acknowledged nuclear armed state. And so I think one of the contours of this is, are we talking about, again, are we sticking with something which is exclusively about Iran not weaponizing, or can one move to a conversation that has occasionally been floated but has never gained traction for reasons that are probably obvious, which is about having a WMD free, weapons of mass destruction free Middle East, West Asia. And for me, it's one of those remarkable head-scratching things that for decades we've talked about Iran and the nuclear threat. Israel occupies all the Palestinian territory, occupies territory of other states, threatens other states consistently, and makes good on those threats very often, is a nuclear-armed state. And yet we kind of skip over the idea that maybe that's also not okay. Maybe that is a tremendous encourager of Iran's possible nuclear weaponization. Now, the JCPOA deal that we've talked about had the kinds of inspections, the kinds of safeguards, the kinds of long-term horizons, the kinds of Iranian commitments, the kinds of International Atomic Energy Agency oversight. You also had in Iran a religious edict, a religious ruling by the now assassinated former supreme leader that Iran would not pursue a nuclear weapon. Now, you may say, well, I'm not going to
pull the other one.
Exactly. I'm not going to the supermarket with that. But you no longer have that leader. And I think it's an open question whether Iran's takeaway from this is North Korea, Iran crosses the nuclear threshold on the North Korean example, doesn't do that on the Iranian example, compare and contrast. I don't think it's a given. I think for me, the jury is out.
But you'd also look at Ukraine, right? So you'd say that Ukraine gives up its nuclear arsenal under certain guarantees. And I suppose, speaking personally, one way in which my own personal take on nuclear weapons has evolved is I was every nuclear bomb is a threat to the existence of the human species. Any kind of disarmament is good, to now being a lot more skeptical of uneven forms of nuclear disarmament, which is what we've seen since the 1990s. And it's difficult to draw, any other conclusion from the last 5 years, other than if you are a small to medium state, a nuclear weapon is your only real guarantor of sovereignty.
Right, if you're in an area where you're threatened. So that debate is almost certainly going on inside Iran, but it's also going on more broadly in the region because, first of all, Israel is seen as a more destabilizing, radicalizing threat across the region than it was previously. The relations that some states in the region, not only but especially in the Gulf, have with the US has been shown to really fall short when it comes to the US taking their security interests seriously, or really being able to guarantee their security, or whether having an American base on your soil makes you more vulnerable or more secure. We've seen the extent to which Pakistan has kind of moved into this space, which itself is a nuclear-armed state. So
turns out a luxury hotel economy isn't enough to protect you.
Who would have thunk it?
Who would have thunk it?
And in that respect, we may be at a point where the choice is far more binary between this idea of trying to pursue no nuclear weapons in the region or accepting that there will be, not just in the case of Iran, but greater proliferation in the region. That's the kind of thing that doesn't play out over a short time horizon. That plays out much longer.
I mean, let's talk about Lebanon. So we're speaking on Wednesday, yesterday, which was Tuesday. Trump seemed to have very sharp criticism for Israel's strikes on Lebanon, the civilian death toll, etc. He's also said to have argued with Netanyahu on the phone, I think, a couple of weeks ago. And this is the stuff that journalists get very, very excited about. They go, oh my God, is the relationship breaking down? And so I suppose my question for you is it theatre or is it real? And even if it's real, is it important?
And that's spot on in terms of how you framed it. Because we're so used to it. An American president gets frustrated with an Israeli prime minister because they realize they've led them down a merry path. And
who's the fucking superpower here?
Exactly. And then they leak to the press the contents of that conversation and the frustration and the salty language and the expletives. And like, spare me? Like, really? This is structural. If you're serious, then you have an endless shelf of leverage options that you can deploy. And the least relevant thing on that shelf is the F word, right? I mean, who cares whether you swore at the Israeli prime minister? Are you going to follow it through and use your leverage? Are you going to actually threaten things? Are you going to challenge the power structures within your own politics, to put it accurately? And if the answer to that is no, then I really don't care if you escalate up the F word ladder. Because if you don't escalate up the actual leverage ladder and hold Israel to account and make it clear what are the consequences, and you're willing to follow through on that those consequences, and you're willing to do so over a period of time consistently, then you end up where we are, which is you still don't know whether Israel is going to escalate in Lebanon. You also have a situation where so Israel's going to stay in Lebanon, in Lebanese sovereign territory. Israel's still displacing and evacuating Lebanese. There's still more than a quarter of the Lebanese population that can't return to its homes. Israel is still carrying out military operations in the zone that it controls. It previously, from 1982 to 2000, occupied South Lebanon for 18 years. Of course, there's going to be pushback and Hezbollah resistance if Israel remains in Lebanese sovereign territory. And so the way this tends to play out is, you know what? I'm really angry with the Israeli prime minister. What, well, Mr. President, here are all the things you could do. No. What could we give him to make him not go off the rails on this one so we can keep the Iran thing? Sorry? Yeah, what can we give him? Oh, well, they get an awful lot already, Mr. President. Although the people in the room are normally saying, oh, I've got a whole list of things that we could give them, rather than what the imaginary conversation that I just momentarily indulged in.
And so southern Lebanon becomes, you can have southern Lebanon as long as you don't mess with the Iran negotiations.
Let's see if we can say we're freezing the situation as we're freezing the situation elsewhere. So if we get a full agreement in 60 days, but in those 60 days, the situation will at least be frozen in southern Lebanon. In the meantime, you'll try and force the Lebanese government, and you won't use your leverage on Israel. You'll try and use your leverage on the Lebanese government to say, why don't you take this? We really would rather not have another civil war in our country, but that's what you try and push them towards. What can we give Israel in Gaza, in the West Bank, more than they're doing already? Which, of course, in Gaza, people are getting killed by the Israelis every day. They occupy more than two-thirds of the, directly occupy more than two-thirds of the territory in Gaza, etc. And if you're not going to do those things, then despite everything we're hearing, the trade-off may be the Israeli prime minister would love a hug and a visit in the lead up to his election campaign. So maybe you give him things on the personal, political, electoral side of the equation, which may not happen. Trump's also perfectly capable of saying, of course, this guy didn't dupe me. That no one could do that. I'm Donald J. Trump. But he also hasn't pleased me, so I'm going to back the other guy in the election.
I mean, before I want to keep talking about Lebanon, but just on this thing about America's positioning, is the real reason why you escalate up the F-bomb ladder, but not escalate up, cutting military aid or defunding the Iron Dome, which would be a massive one, is because ultimately America hasn't determined that Israel is a liability to its strategic interests. It's still ultimately, from an American perspective, a strategic asset.
So it's really hard for most people, and certainly for most kind of international relations scholars and realists, to make that case. I'd say even harder today, after what's just happened in the Iran war that Israel pulled America into. It seemed like we were having this, they're putting the band back together on the neoconservative front. And even if John Bolton was under investigation, he was living his best day every day. And other neoconservatives were like on the ascendancy briefly during this war. But it hasn't played well with a lot of the MAGA world. And it seems that Trump was convinced relatively early on that he actually wanted to get out of the war, but he didn't know how. So that idea that Israel serves American strategic interests doesn't survive much interrogation, but it does survive American public discourse when filtered through the prism of how Israel, West Asia, Middle East, the world is related to it's not just the blob. Ben Rhodes and Barack Obama, towards the end of Obama's term, used this word to describe the kind of foreign policy establishment in Washington, D.C., but also kind of much of the media landscape. So in that respect, Israel is seen as having as being a strategic asset. You have some Americans say, well, if it didn't exist, we'd have to create it. It does a lot of the things for us in that region that we would otherwise do. I think there's a real tension there with a reality, just basic reality, how much this undermines U.S. standing in the world. I think it's directly undermined also the sense of U.S. military preponderance and invincibility. America has also just kind of done a big show and tell on its kit right now.
I've been calling it Vietnam speed run.
I think that's an excellent one. I wish I'd have thought of it myself. So all of these things are going on. And unless you buy the Israeli line, which some in the US do, that Israel is the first line of defense against barbarism. So if this is a Judeo-Christian civilizational struggle that we're in against the great unwashed brown mass, especially if they're Muslim, then yeah, maybe it does do that. If you don't see the world through that lens, then it's very hard to make that case. But that's where all the other ways that Israel plays in the American political space come into play.
I mean, going back to Lebanon, is that to take us back to last week where there were some Iranian strikes on Israel, that happened following Israel bombing Beirut. And so that seemed to be a little bit revealing of perhaps, okay, this is Iran's perspective, which is we don't want to risk an all-out war again for the south of Lebanon, but Beirut, where Hezbollah is very strong, that's where we're drawing a bit of a line. How does Iranian calculation fit into Hezbollah's prospects in the next 6 months, 12 months?
Yeah, so I'm not sure it's the distinction they would draw between South Lebanon, which is the stronghold in some key respects of Hezbollah. I mean, emptied now largely of its population, but it's where the community that Hezbollah would like to speak for, and in some ways does, and that would in key respects give their backing to Hezbollah. The Shia community in Lebanon is prominent. I'm drawing a distinction between that and Beirut. I think it's more that this was seen as, is Lebanon part of the equation at all? So if you say that we will have a deal and Israel can continue to pursue a war in Lebanon, which, if you remember, this was when the ceasefire is announced in early April. The Pakistani mediator says it includes Lebanon. Israel says it doesn't. America initially says it doesn't, and then kind of says, well, kind of maybe it does. And so that was one of the things. And there was a kind of ceasefire in Lebanon, but one that was so frequently violated and then fully cast away. So I think this was Iran saying it will have to include Lebanon. It was saying that in the context of also the launching of Israeli-Lebanese negotiations with the Lebanese government under American auspices. And so there was this attempt not only to pull apart those tracks, but there was also this attempt to pull the Lebanese government into a place where it would be your main operating arm against Hezbollah. Now, the Lebanese government is trying to play an impossible balancing act. It's lost significant credibility at home. As you can imagine, most Lebanese don't want to say, well, if Israel isn't going to go to war in Lebanon, we'll go to war with each other. They also don't have warm and fuzzy feelings towards the Israelis and the Americans, even if they are also that significant cohort of the population that doesn't like what Hezbollah has done, what Iran has done. So that put the Lebanese government in an impossible situation. And so I think Iran is saying, no, things are going to be done on this track, not that track. The other thing that's gone on is, look, there are different ways of looking at the allies of Iran in the region, like Hezbollah. And Iran would have suggested that was more of a forward defense posture as a deterrent against Israel. Israel would say, well, that's indicative of Iran's attempt to undermine, destroy us. I think the preponderance of evidence is more on the former. But the sense was that this was done, that the proxies had it, as Israel saw them, of Iran, had essentially been devastated and defeated, and now you go
decapitated,
after,
right?
decapitated,
So like
sure.
the leadership had been assassinated, so obviously the organizations can't function. That was
and it went well beyond the leadership. I mean, people remember that kind of beeper attack, which was spectacular, right?
It was in British media when they're like, oh, it's like something out of James Bond. And I just thought the evil that James Bond has done in glamorizing war crimes.
Yes. Exactly. Which Doctor Who never did. Right? So
it's not a war crime if you're wearing a bow tie.
There you go. I know, or a long scarf. I'm dating myself. So the argument was, those have been dealt with. Now we deal with Iran itself. And this is where I think this Israeli overreach, this idea that and this is why I've been trying to argue, that Greater Israel is not just territorial. When it comes to the Palestinian side, yes, it's territorial and it's the physical removal of Palestinians and ensuring there can be no Palestinian national collective existence. Syria, Lebanon, yes, they're in control of parts of territory, but it's actually more than territorial. It's the idea that we can be dominant in this region and that others will either be in a state of perpetual chaos and collapse, see under Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and their goal was that would be the fate of Iran, or they will be useful allies because they see where power resides and there will be relations of dependency on us. So one of the ideas of this war was to pull as much of the Gulf as possible into a relation of dependency on Israel, as it has tried to do with Jordan and Egypt. And that was the hubristic overreach, the idea that with American power, Israel could entrench its dominance. And so one of the things that we've seen is not only that Iran could hold out, but that actually Hezbollah has surprised, not in a good way, the Israeli side, by demonstrating a resilience and a resistance that they thought was probably beyond its capacities now. And having revived this, Iran is not going to say, well, okay, you can go after and finish them. It's not going to allow that to happen.
I want to turn now to thinking about Gaza. You just said that Israel may well have been surprised by the resilience of Hezbollah. Would they be saying or thinking the same thing about Hamas?
If they're thinking straight, they probably would be. Yes.
That's a big if.
It is. And no, it's a real thing when I think people may assume that nothing changes in Israel. Israel's always been like this towards the Palestinians, and there's plenty of things to corroborate that. But the Israeli system can also go through changes, and this loss of a more realist element, even when you're trying to achieve really bad things. And sometimes you're better off when you're trying to achieve really bad things if you know the pace at which to go. And so the loss of that, I think there is a surprise not only at the resilience of Hamas, but also at the resilience of the Palestinian broader public. I imagine there was a sense that people would be clamoring to leave, that it would have been easier to get people out, which is a declared Israeli goal. The Israeli government set up a special unit, a special authority for encouraging the voluntary, of course, they always call it, immigration of Palestinians from Gaza. In this respect, it's also this narrative that all the leaders were killed. Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, they've been destroyed, and yet here we are. Hamas is neither capitulating in negotiations nor on the ground. It doesn't have a significant capacity right now to strike at Israel. It's also not going to try when the odds are so stacked against it. But it's there in the negotiations. It holds out for its positions. And then we see, how Hezbollah has come back, how Iran has come back. And I can't help but think that Israel went into this also trying to send a signal, resistance is futile, and that has boomeranged. And there is a sense now that some of the resistance has been quite effective, at huge cost, but has been really rather effective, that a resistance narrative resonates more loudly, and that in fact, if I move from that resistance camp, you also have a camp in the region now that has begun more seriously to ask itself the question, how do we protect our own interests vis-a-vis Israel? How do we be in a place where Israel can be more militarily deterred and contained? Because I think Israel used to push a policy in the region of the dual containment of Iran and Iraq in the 80s. And so it kind of, amongst others, backed both sides in the war. And even during the Iran-Contra scandal, under the Islamic Republic of Iran, after the revolution, was secretly helping get funds and money and weapons to Iran so that they would stay in the war against Iraq. And I think much of the region today that feels threatened both by Iran and by Israel is thinking about dual containment, not just of Iran, but also of Israel.
Well, I suppose there's an interesting parallel also in terms of the containment strategy vis-a-vis Hamas. So that was obviously the name of Tarek Bakoni's excellent study of Hamas Contained, and views October 7th, Operation Al-Aqsa Flood as the explosion of the containment strategy. So what's the new Israeli orientation towards Hamas? Do they have a theory of total victory against Hamas still? Or is it, okay, this is a level of Hamas that we can tolerate?
Look, Israel, first of all, encouraged Palestinian division. So I don't really buy the idea that they were encouraging the funding of Hamas. But part of my argument about there being some pragmatic thinking was keep the population just below. keep the population just above the starvation line, was it's okay to have Hamas there if Hamas can't pose much of a threat. You want Palestinians to remain divided. Then there was this narrative of total victory, and I think they're still, in the most part, conceptually in the idea of total victory, but that it will take longer. And the intention is to stay in Gaza. The intention, in fact, is to carry out as much displacement and destruction in the West Bank as well. And I think one will see an intensification of that. One already sees an intensification of that. I know people tend to focus on the kind of settler violence, which is an important thing, and it is a source of horror to Palestinians living in the West Bank. But that is, of course, backed by the military, backed by the state. You don't have a settler militia without the backing of the state. And that is part of this attempt to get this zero sum. Israel is still in an eradicationist position vis-a-vis the Palestinian National Collective, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to eradicate every individual, but you have to eradicate Palestinian nationalism, which means a lot of Palestinians. It also means removing Palestinians. It also means trying to ensure the shape of future Bantustanization. And so what Israel is trying to do is, because there's no desire in Israel to have a Palestinian negotiating partner for withdrawal or peace or any of this kind of thing. So the alternative to Hamas in Gaza, as the Israelis see it, is perhaps a manager of Gaza that will be shorn of Palestinian national aspirations, of a Palestinian collective sense, that will much more neatly fit into that Bantustan model, and then perhaps to copy that over into the West Bank. But in practical terms, because Israel isn't even allowing that to float, Israel is building up its own militias in Gaza. So it's worth paying attention to the idea that while Israel talks about disarming, Israel is pouring arms into Palestinian militias that it is backing in Gaza. We mentioned Lebanon. We mentioned that Israel occupied southern Lebanon from 1982 to 2000. Israel built a proxy militia force there, the South Lebanese Army, which it armed, it trained, it funded, and it's not working in Gaza, and I don't think it will. But they're still toying with this. They're still playing with this.
I want to move on and I suppose ask you about how the last 3 years since October 7th may have challenged or shaped your commitment to negotiation, international law, and diplomacy. Has it challenged your commitment to those things at all?
Yes. Particularly in the sense of international law, of just how useful a vehicle is this. Not that I naively thought, well, as soon as you prove there's a violation of international law,
you tap the relevant statute.
Exactly. Well, there you go. Or home in time for tea. So, if one comes from the basis that negotiations are only relevant if the ground has been set, and I don't mean that people have done their homework on the subjects that they're negotiating. I mean, do both parties, and especially does the more powerful party, in what is a deeply asymmetric reality between Israelis and Palestinians in this instance, do both parties come into this? Does the powerful party come into this thinking there's a reason it has to make concessions? So if you haven't accumulated leverage, if Israel, in this instance, feels that why do we have to negotiate anything away? Negotiations are just another way of carrying forward a maximalist position, then there's no point in negotiations. So there is no point currently, because those conditions have not been created. And again, international law only comes into the equation if the party trying to push for the implementation of international law has power that it can bring behind it. Now, it will matter if the International Court of Justice makes a designation that Israel is violating the Genocide Convention, that Israel has violated the Genocide Convention in Gaza. That's the case that South Africa have brought. A number of countries have put in their own submissions, have attached themselves to the South African position. The UK is not one of those countries. The UK did do that, actually, in the case of Myanmar and the Rohingya, in a case brought by the Gambia. So we see, interesting, it's South Africa, it's the Gambia that have brought these cases. In one instance, the UK said, yes, our finding aligns with this. This is the submission we're going to make to the ICJ. In this case, it hasn't. It matters that the ICJ made a ruling as it was requested to do so by the UN General Assembly in an advisory opinion on the illegality of the entirety of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories on June 18th, 2024. And it set out what any country has to do to be in compliance with that ruling. But the Attorney General here, if we're talking again UK, the Attorney General has, as I understand it, written a response to that, and it has been collecting dust because the government hasn't wanted to deal with it. Of course, on the flip side, we've seen how the US has attacked the ICJ, has attacked the ICC, has gone after those institutions. So, shock horror, this is about relations of power. And when it comes to those things, it's also about relations of power. And, here, I guess one of the things that has been most frustrating over this period is there has been a huge mobilization of people who have said, this is just not okay. Some people have said, I see the injustice and the inequality in my own life reflected here on a grand scale in such an egregious way. I see how my government fails to address those things at home, reflected in how it fails to address things over there. But it has not translated thus far sufficiently into a change of policy, which means we have to accumulate more power. And the frustration is that after everything that has happened, Israel has still been successful in creating the conditions where Palestinian division, the inability for a Palestinian movement that could really carry this struggle as a national, consensual, politically disciplined movement. So you rely on civil society. Civil society can't carry that weight. You need political movements rooted in being able to express the kind of national liberation aspiration of a people to do that, and that hasn't happened. And that also in the region, there's still been an inability and unwillingness to break themselves away from status quo politics. So you still don't have the power either of that movement or of state actors, and often in the corporate arena, there's even greater complicity now than there was.
I was really struck the last time that we spoke, which I really encourage viewers to go back and have a look at that interview because it was one of the most comprehensive accounts of the Oslo process that I've ever been a part of myself, but also managed to consume as an explanation as well. And when I rewatched the interview, I was really struck by how my assumptions of some of the things that you were going to say were really, really challenged. So I was really surprised by some of your takes on the Oslo process when you said, look, Israel were never serious about a two-state solution. Like, part of the project of putting these constraints around a Palestinian state was to try and make sure that it would never happen. And I went away and I started wondering to myself, was that a set of perceptions that you had at the time? Or is that something that you came to on reflection?
Much more the latter. Otherwise, I don't think I would have been there. So the experience of seeing that, okay, the PLO, and the PLO was more credible than, I don't want to exaggerate it, and there were critiques at the time in terms of how the internal Palestinian negotiating team, which really knew its stuff and lent on people like Rashid Khalidi as their advisors, were then overtaken by the external PLO, which was in a moment of historic political weakness after the first Iraq War, where they had kind of backed Iraq against Kuwait, if people remember that, in the early 90s. But it was still a more credible PLO, right? So what struck me was that probably in my naivety, I took at face value the idea that once Israel got to yes on Palestinian acceptance, not only of the state of Israel, but also that the state of Israel would be in its post-Nakba dimensions. So the partition plan that creates the state of Israel, that's advanced by the UN in 1947. Remember, that's a UN before decolonization. So that's a UN of 56 odd members. It's not a unanimous vote at all. It's about 33-13 with abstentions. Even the commission that was established with several states to decide what would be the future of mandatory Palestine after the British said we're going to give up the mandate, even that was split between partition and non-partition. So Israel not only gets the Palestinian acceptance of and recognition of Israel by the PLO, but it also gets the PLO to say we will accept a Palestinian mini-state on 22%, not the 45% which the original partition plan gave it. So the naive assumption was that there is an Israel in which recognition by the Palestinians of that state, limiting their demand in a negotiation to a sovereign state on 22%, would of course be met. I'm sure that there'll be complicated things that need to be negotiated, but what's not to like here if you're taking at face value Israel's historic position? And I wasn't totally naive, but it seemed to me like that was a proposition worth testing. The reality in that negotiation is you couldn't attribute Israeli positions to simply wanting to maximize the security of a state of Israel alongside Palestine, or due diligence in terms of what the 78-22 divide between two states would look like. It became increasingly transparent that this wasn't just nickel and diming the details. This was something structural and far deeper. And, a decade later, in 2002, you have the Arab Peace Initiative, and you have the kind of the Arab states, then endorsed by the Arab League, then endorsed by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, so 50 plus Muslim majority states, endorsing peace with Israel, recognition of Israel in exchange for return to 67, and Israel gets again to yes. And so, but yes isn't good enough. So there's something more going on here. And it's not a couple of badly taken penalties. There's something structural here.
And what does that do, I suppose, to your own sense of self and purpose, right? So you spend so much time and so much of your energy, and pour yourself into these negotiations, pour yourself into these processes, and then you get to a point where you go, all right, this isn't just nickel and diming. You don't want these processes to succeed. I mean, just thinking about how I would reckon with that, I would find it really difficult. I would probably be one of those sunk costs people, and still to this day, trying to sing the same song, because I couldn't look at myself and look at the use of my time through that lens.
I mean, look, in many ways, my story is that I'm a sunk cost person because I haven't gone off and made climate or other things what I kind of wake up and go to bed every day with, but not sunk cost in terms of let's keep trying to push the boulder of something that is apparently it's not just that it's probably unattainable, but it's also not ideal anyway. It's not the thing that it's not the thing that brings most justice, but I also am now convinced that whatever arguments one could make in theory, and there were different strands of Zionism, including non-state-centric Zionism, binationalism, but actual existing Zionism as practiced by the state of Israel has proven itself to be incompatible with Palestinian, not just justice for Palestinians, but well-being for Palestinians. And it's proven itself to be incompatible with actual Jewish safety and security and well-being, because you better be damn sure that you can beat the other side to a pulp. You can sufficiently colonize the native, if you like, if you're running an ethno-supremacist zero-sum effort. And where Israel is situated in the world and the way it rallies opposition to itself, the contempt with which it treats not just the Palestinians but those around it, the narratives around Muslims, Arabs, the seizing of territory, not just Palestinian but Lebanese, in sovereign Lebanon, in Syria, the attacks on other countries, the way they operate on Al-Aqsa, on the third holiest site. So this suggests to me that it's actually rather dangerous. And from a Jewish perspective, and I that matters to me, and I make no apology for that. But I realize that other people may be, well, why is he talking about that? But that matters to me, and it fails to do what's written on the tin. It fails to offer a Jewish future, either to those Jews who are Israeli or to those Jews who are around the world who are being called upon to be enlisted in this somewhat fantastical and deeply ugly attempt to prevent these other people from having their rights. So for me, it just means just think more, revisit it, understand it better. What are the options? Yeah. For me, one of the things now that I think and talk about a lot is, by saying everything I've said, this is not Algeria. Jewish Israelis are there to stay. Jewish Israelis are third, fourth generation, and obviously some go back much further. Some are recent immigrants, but this is a collective presence that has to see in a future of equality their own place. You had to have a freedom charter, which at least on paper set out in South Africa what was the future for Afrikaner white South Africans. You have to do that for Jewish Israelis as well. And sure, I get it. They're genociding you. Not easy, but that's doing politics right, is doing the not easy things on that side as well.
I mean, there's a sensitive conversation that I want to have. And so forgive me if I'm a clumsy speaker.
It's what you're known for, right?
Yeah, really clumsy. Look, my husband would be like, yeah, that is what she's known for.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's obviously anti-Semitic to hold Jewish people in the diaspora responsible for things that the state of Israel is doing. But is there also something of, say, a political obligation or a moral obligation to say, not in my name? How does the principle that we don't blame people for things that government has done, which I think is true, we hold that principle, is that the same as saying, well, there are no political obligations communities, ethnicities, religious groups have when things are being done and trumpeted as being in their interests?
So where it gets more convoluted and difficult is when that same group tries to assert that collectively this is part of us. So here we are arguing for so long, you can't conflate Jews with Israel. You can't hold us collectively responsible. And yet the leadership of the Jewish community is establishment community. Increasingly wants to create this indistinguishability between us here as a community and over there. That if you attack Israel, you're attacking us. But we thought you weren't responsible for this. So which is it? And here's where I would draw a distinction between it is absolutely legitimate, and I would even argue hard to claim that you have some kind of sense of caring collectively for Jewish people. That doesn't have to be at the extent of collectively caring for all people, but it would be hard to say that you do that if you don't give a damn what happens to Jewish Israelis. So that's why I say, if you actually believe in the wholesale physical erasure of Jewish Israelis, then I have a problem with you on an anti-Semitic level. If you're saying they should live in a system where they're not run, where they don't have greater rights than others, they shouldn't. Then why would I have an issue with that? And that's the difference between saying the well-being of that community matters to me versus I'm going to support the structures of a state, of a regime that does all these things that are illegal, often veer into war crimes, and that are, again, incompatible not only with the rights of these other people, but with us having our own safety. And it is a source of huge frustration that the main conflators today are not those who are trying to, have a collective animus against Jews and tarring us all with the same brush, but the main people who go in for the conflation equation are my own people, are people who claim to speak and they are not thinking, I would argue they're not thinking about the well-being of Jews anywhere in the world, but they're certainly not taking the interests of the Jewish community in this country. We are citizens of this country. They are not taking the interests of this community as paramount in what they do. And there has been just such a thorough osmosis or takeover, if I'm being more blunt and honest, of Israeli interests into so much of establishment Jewish communal life that we are in the throes of an incredibly painful attempt to disentangle those things. And there are many forces in the community who are committed to the non-disentanglement, to keeping those things together. And then there are those of us who are saying, no way. Not only not in our name, but this is a disaster and you are leading us over a cliff.
I was thinking this with regards to the synagogue, which was hosting a real estate event at which property was being sold from illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank. Because my general principle is don't protest sites of religious worship, all right? Religions can think all sorts of nutty things they want. I just don't think it's good for community cohesion if you protest a religious site. Now, when a place of worship then becomes a site of an active criminal activity and something, as awful as selling off occupied land, my commitment to leave religious sites alone, that's out the window. Is there an extent to which Zionism, but you could also view this as ethno-nationalism abroad more generally, starts putting really unique strains on the multicultural settlement that we have here in the UK? That it's hard to say, look, leave all the religious sites alone if those religious sites become, spaces in which ethno-nationalist expansion abroad happens.
And of course it does. So there's not a universe in which that, first of all, there's not a universe in which that event should have been allowed to take place. Certainly not if the organizers had charitable status or if it was in a venue that had charitable status, but it shouldn't be allowed to happen full stop. And so first and foremost, this is a failure of government. And then I hate to see there being a protest outside a synagogue. And I actually think it may have been smart not to have done that. It may have been smart to have done something symbolic, which would have still got criticism, which isn't to say it wasn't legitimate. What was going on in hosting that event was absolutely wrong. And I'd have liked to have seen the main opposition to that being Jewish led. Okay, and there is. I think we've both been to some of the rallies, and there's a Jewish presence there. It's a proud, out and open Jewish presence. I think there's a great atmosphere at most of the rallies. I wish that there was more of an acceptance that we are just as authentic, and I would argue more authentic, because that's my understanding of Jewish values, Jewish ethics, the lessons to be learned from Jewish history, representatives of that community. But that's not how it's taken. I think there's been a huge failure, if I may say, on the part of the so-called public intellectuals in the Jewish community and those who are liberal to acknowledge a whole host of things. So of course, ethnic nationalism and kind of multiculturalism that's a pretty empty Venn diagram crossover section, right? And this is where, one has to understand that structurally, the relationship between Zionism and any anti-racism movement is also pretty non-existent, because Zionism, in its essence, in its core, believes that the answer to anti-Semitism is leave. Is that, of course, there's anti-Semitism. That's the whole point. You should be here, not there. But that can't be the premise for the Jewish community in this country. If that's what you believe, then why are you here?
But you can see, the sort of parallel, because I'm Indian and Bangladeshi, right? The border got slammed down the middle. It doesn't make any sense. And I can see in Indian politics that there is an attempt to run an Israel-style playbook in terms of saying Hindu phobia exists. That's why you need muscular Hindutva in the form of a Modi government, etc., etc. I think that it's played out less in a British context than it has with Zionism, but it's still actually been there, right? You can look at what happened in Leicester a few years ago through that lens. You can, look at the sort of growing strains of Hindutva in this country. And I look at that and I go, we actually sort of need a bit of a new language of diasporic identity. Because the multicultural one, where you've got, your big tribal chief who speaks for you on the BBC, but there is still this real logic of separatism, right? It's like, we get to do what we want within this space, just don't look too hard. That doesn't actually propose much in the way of a sort of hybrid, diverse and dynamic British identity in which lots of people can participate. And it also doesn't allow you to shift in your cultural identity either. It doesn't allow you to change. It doesn't allow you to go, well, actually, I am different. When I go to, West Bengal, or if I go to Dhaka, I am different. I'm also different from a lot of English people here too, and that's fine. Is there a space for a sort of renewal of diasporic Jewish identity, which is sort of saying, we're not going to leave it to Zionism to define who we are?
So I totally agree in that description of diasporic identities. And that's why, those of us who are deeply critical, who see the damage that Zionism is doing, we all know people there. So when something happens in Israel, we are phoning our friends and checking, are you okay? We exist with the reality of that community. It's part of our lives. And so for most of us at least, don't get that wrong, that there's no connection to that or care about what's going on there. I think that's precisely where we are in this moment in Jewish history. I think we went through a moment of almost unassailable Zionist ascendancy. Of course, not everyone was a Zionist, but it was largely unchallenged. And I think that era is over. And you already see people saying, okay, I want to center in some respects my sense of Jewishness. How do I do that outside of the confines of an Israeli-centric, a Zionist-centric way of existing as a Jew, where, loyalty, filialty, deference to Israel is supporting Israel, going there, sending kids there on Israel summer camp. And that's what people are trying to forge, both in religious ways, because it's permeated that so much, and in other cultural ways, because so many of the existing Jewish communal spaces are permeated with a deference to a country that so many of us have such a problem with what it is doing that we can't find our place there. I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a book, I don't know if you've come across Molly Crabapple.
Yeah.
The History of the Bund. Now, I was with Molly and she's telling me, it was number 4 New York Times bestseller. Now, I'll have a guess at what a significant cohort of that readership, where they are coming from. It would be considered a quite obscure point because it doesn't really have a continued existence, and the winners get to write history. And so it's first of all, it's a brilliant book. But why the interest in this book is Jewish people, and especially younger Jewish people, want to capture a sense of continuity with a Jewish past that is not mediated through Zionism in Israel. And the Bund was a Jewish socialist, part of the overall communist revolutionary movement, but that thought that you needed a Jewish workers' bloc within the broader working class, because the Jewish working class, when organizing, also had to deal with hostility on the basis of them being Jews from the non-Jewish comrades. The hunger for people to find those points of connection, because everything has been so subsumed under the blanket of you mediated all through Zionism, speaks to that book, speaks to a poll amongst British Jews, where I think it's in under 30s, by an establishment Jewish organization, I think it's the Jewish Policy Institute. It's about 50-50. Under 30s define themselves as Zionist versus non or anti-Zionist. Now, you wouldn't believe that for a moment if you saw things in the ultra-Orthodox community, factions within that. So we are trying to, without having communal spaces that are already there and available for us to organize and to come together, and in which there's a sense of rejection and a sense of alienation, trying to come to terms with that, trying to struggle with that. It feels ever more critical because of the attempts to use the Israel issue to bludgeon civil liberties in this country. It feels ever more critical because of the domestic politics. I mean, the fact that the Jewish communal establishment groups, shamefully including the Reform and liberal progressive Judaism, would have a rally against anti-Semitism in which the leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage, was invited to speak, and the Jewish leader of the Green Party, Zach, was not invited to speak. By the way, the attendance was maybe 8,000 to 10,000. Now that tells me that the communal leadership is failing, by the way. If after everything that happened, this is after the Golders Green Institute, after Manchester synagogue shooting, with everything that's happening, that's who you can turn out from community and people who are willing to ally with what you're doing? You're failing. You're failing your own people, your own community. You're failing miserably. You're not speaking to people. That morning, so Farage didn't go. Richard Tice went, who's the deputy leader of Reform. That morning, he is on Laura Kunsberg on the BBC, refusing to distance himself from or criticize a just elected Reform councillor who has said something along the lines of Nigerians should be the Nigerians to fill in potholes. Mm-hmm. And part of how he positions himself in that Laura Kunsberg interview, which wasn't very challenging, shock horror, was to say, well, we're the good guys, I'm going to the anti-Semitism rally. And the organizers of that rally didn't think to distance themselves. For me, mind-blowing, but thoroughly understandable when you see how the Jewish community has volunteered to have itself co-opted as part of a narrow, exclusivist, racist push in this country. And it's like, so it was Christian civilization, it was kind of Christian against Jew. Historic anti-Semitism comes from readings of Christianity. But now it's okay because it's the Judeo-Christian civilizational struggle against Islam.
Yeah, I was going to be like, hey, we always knew the Romans killed Jesus. What's going on here?
So, well, exactly, because that's not where anti-Semitism comes from. So suddenly, oh, good, it's us with the Christian. In what universe does that end well for Jewish people? Is that? But that is also a Zionist logic, a deeply Zionist logic.
I mean, my final question is this, because there's going to be a lot of young Jewish people who are watching this and going, I was raised with certain ideas about Israel. I was raised with certain ideas about Zionism. And I'm curious about a way out, still within my Jewish identity, but out of that way of thinking. You already mentioned Molly Krabappel's book. Are there any other things that you would recommend for someone who's just starting out on that journey?
Look, there is Na'amod, which I think does really great work in opposing the occupation and apartheid, and mobilizes on that issue as a proudly Jewish contribution to that struggle. And it's difficult. It can lead to, spats or worse within families. But I think we're finding our people now. It's more difficult in somewhere like the UK, just because of economies of scale, than it is in the US. Much larger community. So, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend the path I took, which is go live there, join the Israeli military, go into the Israeli government and be a negotiator. But I think there is so much more out there now, and there probably was then. I'm probably being really generous on my younger self that I was not sufficiently questioning, and I didn't grow up in a really narrowly thinking home. In fact, most of this comes from the kind of Holocaust family stories and well, wait a minute, surely our tradition is anything like this is wrong, and that's the basis for so much of it. But I just start by questioning, what are the uses to which this is being put? Why were you, if you were, siloed into this kind of way of understanding things? How does that relate to power structures, whether here or there? And then just interrogate that history and find your people, because they're there. And I mean, if it is the case that there are lots of Jewish young people listening to an interview on Novara Media, then we're already part of the way there.
Inshallah.
Inshallah, exactly.
Daniel Levy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Ash. Great to talk to you.
Great.